Before I dive into this video, I just wanted to give you a quick warning. This was a video I tested a overhead camera mount with, and I eventually decided not to use it because of some quality problems you'll see in this video. It focuses quite regularly on my hand instead of on the model, but ultimately the instruction in this video was pretty good, so technical problems aside, I felt it was definitely worth sharing with you. Hey there flock, Mike from Epic Duck Studios here, and today I'm going to be painting the Wild Elf Geomancer for Relic Blade. Now I'm going to be painting this in a cel-shaded style, just something I've been working on recently. It's really new for me, and what it really comes down to is trying to make it look as much as possible like it's straight out of a comic book or from an old hand-drawn animated movie. So when I do that with bold colors, a lot of really crisp highlights, and very heavy black lining between the different details. So I'm going to be going over that whole process while I paint this miniature. So just for reference, this is the art from the package. I'm going to be matching this pretty closely. I may deviate a little bit in the color of the clothing, but for the most part, this is really what I'm going for. And what's great is this is actually basically already cel-shaded as well. So it kind of gives me something to start from as far as that goes. Though I'm going to be taking it to a little bit more of an extreme because I'm working with a smaller piece, and on the tabletop it just seems to punch better. So first I'm going to start by laying down some darkish base coats on all the different aspects. So for the skin, I'm going to begin with some Citadel Cadian Flesh Tone. Now with this form of painting, it's really important that your different coats kind of stand on their own. They're very opaque. You don't really have nice smooth transitions. Instead, you actually have very stark linear transitions between layers. So it's very, very different from other forms of painting. You really don't have to rely on any kind of blending, and in fact, you almost want to make sure you don't. So in a way, this is a very huge departure from most traditional tabletop painting styles, and I think that's part of what makes it so striking. Now for now I'm just going to fill the eyes in very, very carefully. I don't want to lose the detail, but I'll come in with specific paint for the eyes afterwards. I'm really just concerned with making sure my base coats are pretty solid. Just doing a quick once over to make sure I didn't miss anything here. Now I'm going to start her hair with some Citadel Scrag Brown. My intention is to eventually get it to a nice, vibrant, sort of reddish color, but I want to start with a reddish brown as the base coat. Now, one of the important aspects of this painting style is the heavy black lining when you're kind of finishing the piece off. So because there's going to be all this black line happening, I like to make sure my base coat colors are probably more where you would normally find a mid-tone. I like them to be a little bit brighter because there's basically going to be a whole lot of hand-drawn shadow going on afterwards, already really darkening things up. And so you want to start from kind of a lighter base point than you normally would. I'm going to grab some Castellan green for the base coat of much of her clothing. Now the more I look at it, the more I think that might be too dark, so I'm going to add just a little bit of a lighter green to it, in this case some Citadel Strachan green. Now, because of the large black lines that are going to be basically delineating each detail, if you do go a little bit, over the edge of one detail into another, it's really not too important. You also miss little bits. You can see right in here, there's just a tiny little spot of white between her glove and her skin that should have been skin tone and I missed. That's going to get a black line right over it later, so it doesn't really matter at all. I'm going to switch to a little bit of a game color khaki for her pants. Come back to the green just to get these little wraps around her knees. Alright, now for her gloves, boots, and belt, I want to switch to a little bit of a darker brown just to differentiate from the khaki color already happening. Now I've already got some brown in her skin and hair as well, so I really want to just take this a different direction. So I'm going to go pretty dark and use some Citadel rhine oxide hide. And that's pretty much base coat done. I'm going to just throw a little bit of gray down on the rocks on the base as well. And actually a little bit of both rhine oxide and castling green on the base itself. I had to get a little bit too much water in there. The reason I'm painting the base is that with the cel-shaded look, it's really hard to carry that onto flock or gravel or any sort of textured base. But I can paint it to look like it's cel-shaded very, very easily. And so that's really what I'm aiming for right now. Finally going to throw down just a little bit of Mechanicus Standard Gray on the rock itself. Alright, so that's base coats down. So now it's time to just begin highlighting it, and really that's just a matter of lightening up all these base coats in a really blocky fashion. I'll be painting the face last because it's got some details that really just don't fit into this sort of workflow. Now I'm going to be using heavy body titanium white, which dispenses a lot of paint. So you're going to have way more on the palette than you need. And that's okay. I'm going to bring a little bit of this over and add it to the green mix. Oh, it's actually too light. Forgot to actually just use a little bit of straight Strachan green in the middle. So let's get that on the palette as well. We won't need much. So you can start there. I'm going to just test it on the green on the base. Perfect. So on the base, I'm just sort of trying to paint some kind of abstract grass structures in the green area. And that's really all that I'm doing at this stage here. And just repeat on the opposite side. Now we're going to do basically the same thing to our clothing. This is pretty close to the base coat color, so it's not showing too much. Alright, so now I'm going to go over back to the green-white mix and just add some smaller, sharp highlights. Alright, and then I'm going to continue just with some straight white, no green mixed in. I'm going to keep this pretty much just to the highest points. Now, this particular heavy body paint, you can see it's actually fairly translucent. So even though I'm putting down this thick, pure white paint, a lot of the base coat color or underlying color is still showing through. Now, some brands of heavy body acrylic are more opaque than others. So the skin was based with Cadian flesh tone, so I want to go lighter than that. And to do that, I'm actually going to go into some Reaper paint colors. Alright, so I'm going to come in next with some Reaper Fair Skin. I'm actually finding the jump between the two fleshes was a little bit too far, so I'm going to mix a mid-tone up. Now just a little bit of pure white, just on a couple of muscles. Now I'm going to bring the white into the khaki for her pants. This one's pretty straightforward, there's not a lot of this to do. And now same thing with the rhine oxide. I'm going to start bringing in a little bit of weight at a time. You can see as I start to bring more and more white into this, it actually starts to take on almost a purple tint. So this might actually be a good place to switch up and actually just go to a completely different color, like bringing the khaki in and using it as a highlight instead. So we don't really want to push the brown leather into a purple, it just doesn't look right. Got our hair and a little bit of work to do on the rock here. I'm going to bring in a little bit more rhine oxide here on the base because it was just a little bit thin the first time it went down. I'm going to grab a little bit of administratum gray for working on the rock. Same thing as every other step, coming now to plain white. So now just working on the base, I'm going to use a little bit of vallejo earth on the rhine oxide. Now this dropper is basically empty, which is why I just dispensed that with the brush. And one more time with the white. Maybe not quite that far. Alright, let's do something with his hair. So I'm going to load a little bit of scrag brown back on the palette. And one more time with the white. I'm probably sensing a pattern here. Going to the almost white section over here in the mix, and just basically repeating. And then finally, actual pure white. So that's the base coats all done. So now it's really time to just start laying in the lining. Like I say, I'll be painting her eyes last. And adding a little bit of color to the face. But I want to get basically all the line work down first. And for that, I'm going to be using some De La Rowney India black ink. It comes with its own built-in eyedropper. You really don't need a lot of it. 1-2 drops total is going to work just fine. And for this, I'm going to be using a liner brush. It's a very, very long, thin bristled brush. I picked this up at Michael's for about $2. It's a pretty cheap brush. The point is it comes to a very, very long, thin point. So you can just basically pick any part of the model and just start outlining the separate details. So to begin with, there's basically going to be two different kinds of lines I do here. The first will be the obvious ones that denote the differences between different details. So, you know, drawing the distinction between her belt and her shirt, for example. But I'll also be adding some lines to indicate things like folds in the fabric and so on. Because the goal here is to make the model look like it's been hand drawn as opposed to hand painted, it's okay if there's a couple little mistakes here and there, as if, you know, you had slipped with your black pen while you were drawing this on a piece of paper. Even, you know, just little variations in the thickness of a line and so on actually lend to the appearance of it being a hand-drawn piece of art. So later I'll be using thicker black lines, especially on the bottom of the model, and creating a sort of hashing look by doing, you know, consecutive, parallel, sort of shorter lines. And I'll be using that to create volume for the shadows. But before I do that, I want to make sure all of the outlining, you know, the outlines between different details, as well as outlines in details themselves like muscle groups, folds in the fabric, and so on, are all done, because I don't want to overdo the black. So I want to make sure all the black that needs to be there, all of the lining is done first before I start adding any black in for shadows. Now, when a piece of the model has a very sharp, crisp edge, that's the perfect place to add a black line across the edge, or along the edge. You can see I'm doing that quite a bit here with the rocks on the base, because they have very, very crisp angles, and they'll basically show up as a black outline no matter what angle you view the model from. Now, I also do that with a few other parts of this model as well, mostly the part of her shirt that's sort of flapping off into the wind there, you know, off to her left. Because that left edge just hangs off into the air, it's really easy to line it and make sure it shows up with that nice, sharp, crisp black line on the edge. Now the hair is really tricky to do because first I don't want to darken it too much. Pretty much any aspect of the face, as in the head, I want to leave a little bit brighter because it creates a focal point if it's a brighter spot of the model. Also, as you can see, the camera is focusing on my hand more than the miniature here, so I cut a lot of this part out, which means you just don't see what I'm doing with her hair. When you look at the finished model, you'll see that I sort of start the lines at her forehead and at the bottom of the hair, and just carry them a little way into the hair between the different sort of clumps that have been sculpted. I don't carry them all the way through because I want it to look like it gets lighter near sort of the voluminous part of the hair. So here I've actually switched to a shorter brush at this point. I'm going to be making a lot of smaller strokes from here on out to add in the tiny little hashes, and I want to make sure the bristles just didn't carry me too far forward. I did find with the longer bristles on the liner, I either wasn't using them correctly, I was just kind of working with the tip of the brush, or it gave me a nice long thin line, but sometimes I just want to create a shorter line. And so I'm just using a shorter brush out of precaution. Again, this is a pretty cheap brush I picked up. This is just a Michael's Artist Loft brush, and I think they're about $4 or $5 at most. So earlier I discussed lining the sharp edges of the sort of flowing part of her clothing, and this is where I actually start doing that now. There's actually some thickness to this flowing piece of fabric, and it has a fairly flat side on it, so I'm outlining both the top and bottom of this edge. So at this point I feel like all of the outline is done and the major details and folds in the fabric and so on have all really been outlined at this point, and so it's time to begin actually shading the model with some additional black. Now you can see my brush stroke now is very different. I'm doing a lot of sort of short consecutive strokes, and I'm doing that to basically add in hatching, which is just, a bunch of diagonal lines against each other or near each other, to basically darken up the general tone of an area. Now, areas like the underside of the leg and the underside of the arms, where they're completely in shadow, I basically make them pitch black. So I pull those lines across the bottom of the model, and I'll correct them from both sides. So they kind of come out as a series of lines on either side of the model. But that way, when you look at the model head on, you actually get the appearance of a black underline on the legs, on the arms, and so on. This hatching look takes a little bit of time to get right, and it is a really intensive process because everywhere you would normally paint in a small shadow, you're instead having to paint in dozens of small lines. And you have to look at them from multiple angles to make sure they look okay. Sometimes you'll even want to crisscross them to kind of fill it in from 2 different angles, especially if you want a darker area. However, even though it's time consuming, this is what really sells the hand-drawn look of this painting style. So here I decide to be brave, and I'm painting some black lines on her face to denote things like the overhang of her eyebrows, the shape of her nose, and her bottom lip. I'm probably going to paint right over these later. Now the angle on this part is a little bit weird, so if you can't tell what I'm doing, I'm actually creating a thick black line on the inside of her shirt between where her neck and the collar of her shirt meet. It's a little bit awkward to film this, to be honest. And this is now where, with the hash marks in place along both sides of the leg, I'm now filling in the space between with just straight black so that you get the appearance of a solid underline when you view the model straight on from either side. So here I'm just painting a black line in between the sort of grassy area I've painted on the base and the dirt area I've painted on the base. I'm going to come back in a little bit later and rough this line up a little bit, creating some texture, again in the form of hashing, going both directions. Right now I'm just sort of creating that basic outline between the two areas. So now I'm going to start adding some blemishes or imperfections to her clothing, just in the form of small circles or extra lines that are kind of out of place, basically to indicate little tears or snags and so on in her clothing, so it looks just a little bit less perfect. And here I'm adding those deep shadows to the underside of the boot, basically the same way I did with the legs, so that if you viewed her from an angle where you were looking at the side of the boot, you would get the impression of a dark shadow there. Or a dark underline, rather. And when viewed from the front, it just creates the impression of a dark shadow. And now I'm bringing in some of that extra texture into the lines on the base. Kind of working both directions with it, so it looks like the grass just sort of has a rough edge where it overlies the edge of the dirty area. So now I'm painting the face, and I'm deviating just a little bit from the comic style for this. I'm not going to be adding the thick black lines to everything because the face is so small that they would just cover everything up and it just wouldn't look good. So I'm going to start by just painting her eyes in with a bit of an off-white, just a slight tint of gray to this. Then using a very fine sort of just straight line through the middle of the eye, I'm going to define the pupil, and I'm just doing this with the black ink. Now I'm bringing a little bit of a rosy flesh tone into her cheeks, just to make them glow a little bit more, give her face a little more personality so it's not quite so flat. And here I'm bringing in a little bit of a deeper red compared to the rest of her skin tone, just to pick out her bottom lip. And here I'm adding some small near white highlights to the tip of her nose, her eyebrows, and her cheekbones. So here I'm painting in her eyebrows, and I'm actually using black for this. Or possibly a really dark brown. I actually can't remember what I used at the time. I actually wasn't really happy with this result, and I went back in before I took the final photos and painted them to match her hair color. So you'll see the photos coming up just very shortly, and they aren't nearly as dark and pronounced in them. Alright, the Relic Blade Wild Elf Geomancer is done. Let's go take a look at the final photos. I think we can all agree that those lighter eyebrows definitely look better. So I think from all these different pictures, you get a sense that the comic appearance can actually work on a 3D object as long as it's well thought out. Basically, no matter what angle you look at this model, you get the sense that it was hand-drawn. Thanks for watching, and thank you for putting up with the awful camera work on this one. There'll be more comic style videos coming to you soon. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this video. There's plenty more here on YouTube. You can also join me twice a week at twitch.tv/epicduckstudios on Thursday and Sunday evenings at 8 p.m. Eastern, where I do stream my painting live. If you want to support the show, you can do that at patreon.com/epicduck. Even giving as little as $1 a month helps keep the lights on and the paint flowing. You can also help by hitting subscribe here on YouTube or sharing this video with some friends. Thanks a lot!